Hi everyone, I'm Anna Walker and I'm the Lent Women's Officer at the Union. Thank you so much for coming. We were so excited when the BBC reached out. It's now their third year. There are 100 other groups right now live having a very similar conversation in Australia, which makes me very happy. It's now trending in Nairobi and London, which is also very exciting. So I'd like to just thank everyone. Thank you to Oliver and to lovely Helen and to the whole of the union. You've all been wonderful. And I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Rachel Padman did her first degree in electrical engineering at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And in 1977, she started a PhD in millimetre wave astronomy and instrumentation at the Cavendish. She held an 1851 research fellowship and then spent 2 years in Berkeley, California as a Miller Research Fellow before returning to the Cavendish in 1984 as Deputy Project Scientist for the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope in Hawaii. From 2005 to 2009, she was primarily involved in administration and teaching in the Department of Physics here, where she was appointed Director of Education. She's a Fellow of Newnham College, a member of the University Council and General Board. Charlotte Chorley is the current Women's Officer for the Cambridge University Students' Union. She's the head of the Women's Campaign and the Student Representative for Gender Equality and Liberation at the University of Cambridge, currently working on improving the experiences of women in academia and formulating a university-wide sexual harassment policy. Charlotte recently spoke at TEDx Brighton 2015 about the beauty industry and is a blogger for the Huffington Post, where she discusses Cambridge and national politics. She graduated from Pembroke College in 2015 with a double first in English. Ellie Olcott is a second-year HSBS student at Magdalen College. She's also a president of the Cambridge University Women in Business Society. CAMWIB is a forum for wider discussion of gender issues in the workplace. Ellie is also involved in student journalism, most recently acting as interviews editor for the TAB Cambridge. Lola Olufemi is a second year studying English at Selwyn College. She's the BME rep on the KUSU Women's Campaign, a committee member of the KUSU BME campaign, and runs FLY, the BME Women's Network. She identifies as an angry black feminist and is interested in intersectional activism. She has facilitated workshops and discussions on race and gender at her college, as well as written about these issues in student press. Please welcome our panelists. I think, Lola, if it's okay, I'll start with you, because I guess the question is, why do we still need to have this conversation in 2015?
I think it's really, really important to keep having these conversations, and they are still important because if you look at the things that women and non-binary people around the world are still facing, if you look at things like their position in academia or things like sexual assault, domestic violence, I could sit here and list all of the issues that still affect women around the world. If you look at who has access to education, who has access to clean water and sanitation, it's disproportionately, the people who don't have access to those things are disproportionately women, and that is because of systems of disadvantage. So I think it's often when people talk about feminism not being, or talk about the battle being won, or feminism not being relevant anymore, I just think it's a load of rubbish, because if you ask people to really investigate why it is that women are at specific disadvantages in industry in all different parts of the world and stuff like that, then yeah, if you really investigate it, you can see that it is because of a specific system, I think.
Wow. And Dr. Padman, do you think issues for women in Cambridge start at the admissions, and what would your advice be to women in STEM?
Oh gosh, I think admissions actually is pretty fair. I mean, I'm involved in admissions for my college in Newnham, and I know a little bit about the various admissions committees. I think the university bends over backwards, and where you look at large discrepancies in numbers, then I think that is largely reflected in applications, actually. So I don't think the university admits disproportionately. We are puzzled still, I think, by why we can't get more applications for some subjects, and I'm thinking particularly about what you might call the dry sciences, physics, material science, mathematics, engineering. The number's not bad, they're sort of 25%, but you might think it ought to be more, and that's not a problem for the university, but it's a surprise, I think. Sorry, your second part of your question was?
Why do you think that is? Why are women not wanting to apply to STEM subjects, and what can we do to counteract that?
Well, I think we might come back to this later, but my sense is that minorities are self-perpetuating, or at least majorities are self-perpetuating. Look at it that way, that if you see that the majority of people doing some subject by a large majority are men, then most women will say it doesn't seem like a women's thing. I mean, that's a huge pressure, and I think it applies to all minorities, male or female, any other sort, anywhere. Role models are essential, but they're not people who go out there saying, I'm going to be a role model. They're just people doing it.
Right. Yeah, I think it is really important that people have role models that look like them. Charlie, Ellie, anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. I think talking about applications to admissions are like two very different things, and there certainly seems to be, with regards to the application statistics, a kind of gendering of subjects. So like you obviously see a higher amount of women applicants for things like veterinary medicine, art history, etc., and then vice versa for engineering. I think like 2014 had 75% applications from men applicants, which is obviously problems lower down in society and before applications to university occur. But what's like really interesting, I think something that the university can work on is like within the intake, the success of the applicants should be equal, and it's just not. There is a huge disparity in terms of academic attainment across subjects within genders.
Because you've been running a Women in Academia campaign with Kusu. How is that going? What are you doing? And do you think the future's looking good?
I'm positive about it. It's a kind of a broad project looking across subjects and across tiers of education, addressing kind of problems. The ones that we can identify like real quantifiable problems is kind of like the arts, especially English and history, where there is a almost 50-50 intake of men and women, but I think it's like a 10% gap in firsts, so obviously there's a real problem there, and we're working on kind of looking at whether that is something to do with the supervision system, whether it's to do with assessment methods, whether it's to do with biases in marking and sexist markers, those kind of things, and also looking at the cultural environment in which we educate, what it means to educate someone, as well as who is educating them, whether we need more professors and lecturers, we need role models, and that's certainly something that CamWeb does really well in terms of providing role models in traditionally male-dominated paths, I think.
Wow. And what do you think the role of, Dr. Pappen, we were talking about this the other day, the role of women-only colleges in Cambridge? I've heard like quite a few men saying that it's now discriminatory not to have men allowed in women's spaces, and that becomes a self-fulfilling and self-perpetuating problem. What do you think about Newnham and Murray Edwards?
Yeah, statistically we know that the presence of men in terms of like taking examinations, for example, that women will usually perform worse when surrounded by men. And then you kind of expand in the culture of welfare. And it becomes like obvious that there needs to be women's only spaces. And I think the central argument you can say to that is like, until society is equal, then you need to have women only spaces like this.
And that's the history of an establishment, maybe. If you look around you, this place wasn't built for females, it was built for males, and recognizing that and seeing how it can affect someone's perception of an institution is definitely important.
I think that's the hardest thing, is it's not recognised.
Yeah,
because on paper
right.
everything
It's not
seems
talked about
very
either.
yeah. And it's the same. They say the admissions process is colourblind, which is obviously really problematic. Yeah, I think. Sorry.
Can I come in on the women's colleges
Yeah,
thing?
please.
I mean, that's something I said to you the other day. One of the interesting statistics is that I've been Director of Studies in Physical Sciences at Newnham for about 20 years. And in that time, Newnham and Murray Edwards, Newhall as was, have supplied, two colleges between them on average, have supplied about half of the physicists in Part 2 physics. Right, so the other 29 colleges add in as many women again as two. Now that's perhaps not quite true the last 2 or 3 years, in fact, but that's an average over a very long time. And I think you do want to ask what it is about being in a women's college that enables women, many more women proportionally, to take that risk of going, what they see as a risk, I think, of going on to Part 2 physics. So we don't know what we're doing right, but we do know it has an effect.
Right, amazing. I'd like to quickly move to talk about lad culture, binge drinking, and its connection to sexual assault. And Ellie, we had a really interesting conversation about lad culture.
Yeah, so obviously, like, lad culture definitely has some pernicious effects in our society. I'm not trying to generalise about male behaviour at all. But I think we do need to accept that some of the drinking societies, for example, do promote a certain aggressive and sexualized jokes in swaps, for example, and recognizing that and also challenging it and accepting that actually going to consent workshops at the beginning when you're on Freshers Week is very important. I remember when I started university, they advertised these consent workshops, and I thought, well, I don't need to go to these. Like, I know what consent is. It's when someone says, yes, I want to have sex with you. That's pretty simple, right? I don't need to go to a consent workshop. But it's so much more complicated than that. It's about having agency of your own body and recognizing that when someone touches you in a way that is not appropriate and it's not acceptable, that you actually do have a right to stand up and say no. And I don't think that's something, I think that's something which maybe needs to be drilled in a little bit more in terms of this lad culture, and for people to really recognize that women have the choice over their own bodies and they can dictate exactly what they do with their bodies. And there is something about drinking and getting together in like a very hyper-masculine setting which can put dangerous attitudes out there, definitely.
I think that is often overlooked, that people do generally feel unsafe, and I think we've all had experiences where we do feel unsafe. But what do you think, Charlie, about everything you're doing for combating sexual assault in the university policy? Is the university receptive to change? Or?
Yeah, definitely. The university at its heart is like does want to protect students, and you kind of have to then put that back into the incredibly complex landscape of the university, in the sense that there are 31 colleges which are all independent academic institutions, which means there is absolutely no regulation that the university can impose and that they're bound by. So when you're talking about getting a policy through, you're talking about getting a policy through to in a very archaic institution high up, and then that somehow being replicated across 31 colleges by people who might not be as receptive as a central body. So kind of we've adopted a top-down approach where I'm lobbying academic officials, which is great, but also like campaigning from the bottom up and trying to change the cultural attitudes, which will hopefully mobilize students to go out and there and actually like talk to their people in their colleges who actually can affect change, which is good.
Amazing. Anything to add?
Well, I mean, I've just dived in and say, I mean, I think one can see all the problems with having 31 separate institutions. One can also see many of the advantages, and it allows things to bubble up from many different places in the bottom. And I think that is happening, actually. I mean, I do see awareness in the colleges. I do see a change in the student body over the 40 years that I've been here, since I was a member of it.
Wow.
I think it's really interesting to also look at how like priorities have changed. As an institution that is quite like holds on to tradition quite a lot, it's really interesting to see how new students come in with new ideas about sexism, like quality liberation, what consent means, for example, and how they like shake things up. It's like I'll tie that into like being on the women's campaign, and often you feel like you are in opposition to an institution that doesn't want to budge on certain issues, but it is only a matter of like bringing people from different generations to the table to talk about how things have changed and how it's important to how our responses also have to change as well, how they have to mirror the times that we live in. I think that's really important.
Right. I think, so the BBC, one of their questions that they're asking everyone today is about social media and the internet. Lola, we were talking about activism and the internet, and the internet as a place to create spaces of communication, allyship.
I love the internet. I think it's done such great things. Social media in general has done such great things for activism and for allowing groups that are marginalized to meet up and show solidarity with each other. So if we think about that we deemed important and who got to, take center stage and whose lives were important was very much determined by who had access to newspapers, who were the faces that we could see. But now with the internet, it's made that idea so much more democratic. So if you can't see yourself represented in a newspaper, if you can't see yourself represented in specific spaces, you can go on the internet and find other people who are feeling the same kind of marginalization as you. And that is really helpful, not only in terms of organizing, but in terms of feeling like you're not alone. So even if we think about like the feminist movement in general, if I as a BME woman don't see my concerns reflected within the mainstream feminist movement, I can go online and find a whole community of women who look like me, who are talking about the things that affect my life specifically. So I think when people like criticize the internet and say that it's making us all X, Y, and Z, I think they overestimate who had access to communication and specific kinds of culture before it started.
Right. Do you think that's a double-edged sword? Do you think there are also kind of problematic stereotypes about beauty and...
Yeah, I think there are problematic aspects to social media and the internet, but I think it comes down to how we use it and how we're aimed critically to think about the internet. Because with all the media we consume, there's no way to escape problematic things. But what sets us apart, or what sets activists apart, or feminists or whatever, is their ability to think critically about the media that they consume. And so it's really interesting also to go on the internet and find all these critiques of people's favorite shows from different perspectives. And yeah, I think that makes us more intelligent. I think it makes, that is a really interesting thing, because you can watch something problematic and know all the reasons why it is that way. And I think that's really helpful as well, even if those things aren't going to go away.
Okay, amazing. Anything to add?
I just wanted to say on this perspective, like following feminist blogs, for example, on Facebook, you get exposed to different ideas on a certain subject, which are quite liberating and amazing. So for example, over the summer I read this article saying we should kind of realign the way we treat young girls. So previously I'd be very happy to just say, oh, that's such a nice floral dress you're wearing, because that's what everyone else around me was telling this younger girl. And actually I said, so she's, for example, my 10-year-old cousin, and I asked her like, what's your favorite book, or what do you want to do when you're older? And she told me, she was like, oh, I love Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, and like I want to become a scientist. And just reading that one article online, which I wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise if I didn't follow these certain trends on social media, I kind of realigned the way I spoke to the girl and made her realize in a small but I think significant way that she isn't just valued on the way she looks, but her ability to do things as well, which I think is important. So social media definitely has a great way of channeling new ideas, definitely.
And I think it's some like really great things for like breaking down dense academic theory. So like when people come to feminism, their first instinct, the way I came through it was through this kind of like academic theory that didn't really make sense to me, but there are loads of blogs that help you deconstruct really important ideas and put them in a language that you understand. And now, like with magazines and all these feminism becoming more popular, it is really interesting to see how making it accessible has made more people realize that they can kind of attach themselves to a specific label. But that again in itself is a double-edged sword. But
what do you think about that label, and the label kind of being, a lot of people say the word feminist has been like commercialized and monopolized publicly?
I think I am for feminism being accessible, because it means that a bunch of women who didn't have access to it before can have access to it. But again, there's this idea that if something's accessible, it has to be simplistic. And I don't really like the idea, or don't conform to it. Because when people say things like, oh, feminism just means that you want equality between men and women, that's like huge oversimplification of different types of feminism, of like the movement in general. So I think there are ways to make it accessible while also keeping the complexity of it, and not making it into this like bite-sized consumerist thing, because then you lose the whole ideas behind it. You lose the reason why you're doing it, and it just becomes a kind of commercial thing that wants to take your money.
Charlie?
Yeah, no, I think there's a central problem with kind of making feminism accessible is conflated with making feminism palatable to the mainstream, which I think kind of goes against what its fundamental end goals are, in the sense that it's a complete revolution of how we relate to one another, how we relate to each other in society, how society is formulated. And trying to make it this kind of, when we talk about it being accessible, we're talking about it being accessible to usually a very specific kind of people who are already very much privileged within society, and recognizing that there are very often different types of feminisms and different layers of feminisms, and that's where we should be like addressing our kind of concerns and productivity towards like bringing those together rather than separating them.
I just want to add, like, at what stage is it appropriate and to introduce females and males as well, or everyone to feminism, because I think for a lot of people they're only exposed to it at university, which is great. I loved learning more about feminism, but at school it was just this like very negative loaded term, and it meant you were aggressive and bra burning and hated men. I was like, oh, I don't subscribe to those values. So there is a certain kind of stigma which attaches to the logo, to the word feminism, which we need to address as well, definitely.
Amazing. And I think, so Chimamanda Adichie, I think, said this best, but she was describing that the easiest thing to do when kind of confronted with sexism or any sort of like complacency with regards to feminism was just to say, like, it will be fine if we work hard enough, especially as like a woman of color in America. If we work hard enough, everything will be fine and there aren't any issues left. And I guess, how do you deal with people who don't acknowledge that there is a problem and that some groups do suffer more than others?
In that perspective, I might just like show them like a little example of what's happened to my friend or myself, someone I know, and ask them to analyze it and say, why do you think this is? Why do you think this has happened to someone? And they might just be like, oh, that person has a really bad attitude towards girls. And it's like, okay, but why? You know, how has that become internalized? How has that become something which is acceptable? Why is it that that person, his friends or like their friends aren't questioning their behavior? Just bringing it, localizing feminism, because at the end of the day, I know it isn't about yourself and it shouldn't be about yourself, but the moment you kind of make it more accessible and couch it in everyday experiences is the moment you can then broaden the discussion and say, actually, everywhere the problems are faced by women every day.
I agree. No, definitely. I think like there's definitely some people who just can't be reached and like won't be reached, and like that's fine. Like put them in a cave somewhere. Because like they're not kind of conducive to your like mental well-being or energy or time. Yeah. They're not worth it. So just don't bother. But then there are those people who you can kind of engage, and I really do think like rooting it in the personal is really important. Especially because like everyday experiences, for example, of sexism, are rooted in like really massive political ideologies, like they are replications of that. But giving someone something tangible to hold on to, and to be like, this happened to me today, or like this like happened to my friend. Like we can talk about, I don't know, like the fact that 100,000 women each year are raped in the UK, or like 2 women every fortnight are murdered by their partner. But like until you talk to someone, like talk to a survivor, for example, like you make it more personal. Like there can be kind of methods of relation, which I think will really hit home. Kind of things. So like, yeah, engage people with discussion, and like, yeah.
I think when you present people with those like massive, when you let them know about those massive oppressive structures, their first response is to kind of be like, well, what can I do? Like, what is my position? How can I combat this thing that you say is so insidious, and this thing that you say is like gives you a structural disadvantage? But I think it comes down to, again, your own personal behavior. And I have this with like men who want to identify as feminists. I think it's a really, like, I don't think it's an interesting question to ask whether men should or be, or whether they should identify as feminists. I think it's more interesting to ask them what they're doing to deconstruct their own gendered behavior, because the small everyday changes that you make in your life, whether it be taking the concerns of marginalized people into spaces that they can't access, calling out your friends, educating yourself, those are the things that are gonna, like Charlie said, affect the structures, because in a way structures are made up of small everyday occurrences. So the more you change the things that you can on like a microscopic level, then the more, I don't know, we might see a kind of crumbling of that structure in a way. So I think that's really important in terms of like engaging people as well.
I'm blown away by the knowledge and commitment of these guys, and I'm much older. I grew up at a different time, and I just simply don't have the insight into the question that they do. The only thing I do have as a sort of scientist come academic is I look back and say these structures have been in place for a very long time, at least as long as we have writing. We know these power structures between men and women existed. So if it's 3,500 years or so since we're aware of them, it's not going to change instantaneously. I think what Ellie said about rooting it in, when you're talking to individuals, rooting it in particular examples is good. I mean, great, in fact. But the thing I would say is we also need to persuade people that the world would be better if feminism was widely accepted, right? So that the people who are presently in that sort of power relationship see that a change would make their life better as well. We're never going to get people to change if they think it's only for changing someone else who's just a wimp and would put up with it, right? We'll change them because they think the world will be better if they make the change themselves, and better for them. There's self-interest in it. And that's very naive, I know, but it's that's as far as I can go.
No, I definitely think that's like a really interesting, and like kind of the benefits to society more generally when women achieve equality are like really well documented in terms of like business, like McKinsey did this amazing study about when women are on board panels, etc. Like they are, if they're in the top, if a business is in the top quartile of gender or racial diversity, they're more likely to reaping kind of like economic benefits. And similarly, like I think in the UK, if women were given equal pay, it would address about 70% of child poverty in the UK because of like how single-parent families often work and how often the burden is put on the mother. So like there are kind of real tangible benefits, both socially, culturally, economically, to women's empowerment. And I think incentivizing that in many ways is a really good way of kind of making people come to see your point of view.
Bell Hooks has this book called Feminism is for Everybody. And it, like, I think just tackling that idea that if feminism becomes more widely accessible, it is only helping a specific group of people is one that we need to tackle as well, because feminism examines things like masculinity and toxic masculinity. And often, you know, the high rates of male suicide are used as a way to kind of silence the issues of women. When men say, well, what about this thing that affects men? Feminism doesn't focus on that. And I think that's straight out a lie, because if we're going to take apart what gender means, if we're going to look at like gendered perceptions and things like that, feminism does examine the reason, like hypermasculinity, aggressive masculinity, the reasons behind why we choose certain behaviors. And so it does have this ripple effect where it helps the people who are mostly negatively affected by patriarchy, which are women and like non-men, but it also has the ripple effect of helping men, because it frees them from these like restrictive ideas about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, etc.
I would completely agree with you there. Also, like that, couching in those terms, and a lot of men's activists, rights activists, will say like, oh, but look at the fact that men don't have rights over children if there's a divorce and those kinds of things. And you locate it back to the fact that in our patriarchal society, the gender roles given to males and females specifically say, you know, that's what the prerogative of the female should do, and that's not helpful for anybody. It's not helpful when, you know, you're going into a toy store and there's very gendered toys. You've got the science experiments and the adventure kits for the boys and the cooking toys and baby pram things for the girls. Like, nothing in biology dictates those roles, and kind of challenging that socialization is beneficial for absolutely everybody.
I'd really like to ask about, a lot of things get shut down because they say we're either excluding men, and a lot of conversations seem to be derailed because by focusing on women and non-men, we are marginalizing men, which is argued to be a reverse form of discrimination. Does reverse discrimination exist? No.
No. I can expand. This idea, okay. I think it doesn't exist because if we're talking about reverse discrimination, that assumes that we're working from a place in which everybody is equal anyway. But if we're looking at society as a hierarchy, as it is, like if men are here and women are here, there's no way that the people in positions of power can never be discriminated against, because men have never been discriminated against socially, politically, economically. They've never, you know, they've never suffered any structural disadvantages because of their gender. Yes, there are specific things that that affect men more than they affect women, but again, that is a symptom of symptomatic of a society that disadvantages women in the first place. So I think the whole idea of reverse discrimination wrongly puts everybody on the right footing. We can get to a stage where maybe 50, 100, a million, I don't know how long it's going to take, where we are closer to being on the same level. But right now, I think it's important to think of that question in terms of power. Who has power? Who has structural advantage? Because things like sexism, things like racism are more than individual instances, they're structural. And so, yeah, I think that's important to take into account.
Also with all female events, if you're saying you're excluding men from this, yes, men have a role in saying, like, fighting for gender equality. We're not trying to say by excluding you from a specific event. That's not true, but do you really think, as a male who wants access to this specific event, for example, an all-female breakfast, do you think the most useful way about going about fighting and showing your respect and solidarity with gender equality is to say, why am I not allowed in the breakfast? That's just not very helpful. They can do other things to show their support.
Yeah, this is like kind of a conversation I have quite frequently with regards to safe spaces and the necessity within a liberation movement. And certainly for me, kind of the disinvitation of men to these events is seen as a negative thing. And it's usually because when I kind of like question men as to why they're angry about it, it's because, you know, like, oh, God forbid that the women are going to sit and like talk about, you know, these problems that I could help with. And I'm kind of just like, well, you know, like, you're scared because they are seen to be revolutionary, and that's exactly what they should be seen as. And yeah, you probably should be scared because this is completely revolutionary. These women are getting into a space where they are privileged enough, or they're able to talk about their experiences without fear of that kind of unconscious censorship that we do with men around. They're allowed to talk about their experiences freely and openly with people who have shared or different experiences, and that is completely, we take that for granted. We think that happens all the time, and it doesn't, and there needs to be sort of like set parameters for those discussions. And understanding that society is not equal, and the voices of men and those in positions of power are heard 1,000 times the magnitude of those who are in minorities or underrepresented is kind of part of, so recognizing the power structures which allow voices to be heard and not heard, and then working out the material ways of addressing that. Like, obviously safe spaces are going to be the way forward, I think.
I guess I'd like to ask whether you think our brands of feminism should be locally based or international. Because often when they are locally based, the criticism is that there are so many more important things to worry about. But then when they become international, there's a real problem in terms of like acknowledging history, acknowledging sometimes it's just not our place anymore to try. Lola, you nodding?
I think that is a really important and interesting question because I don't really understand when people try to minimize. It's not a thing of minimizing the disadvantage that women have in this country versus the outside, because again, in that conversation, you make the global south into this weird other where women are living in, you know, strange things that we can't quite conceptualize, and so why don't we shut up because we've got it so great. There are ways to tackle both things without having to compare them. And I think it's not so much saying that feminists and their concerns shouldn't be global. It's about thinking critically about if we do make our concerns global, how can we do that in a way that does help and doesn't do harm? Because in the history of like feminism, there's been this kind of attempt to liberate or to free women in different, if you take the hijab, for example, loads of second wave feminists have written about how the hijab is oppressive and blah, all these women need to be freed, without actually taking into account specific cultures and taking into account the feminists that are working in those countries on those issues. And so it's less about, I think it's getting rid of this idea that we need to go and save women in other countries. Why don't we invite them to the conversation, or better yet, see how we have benefited from a lot of the work that they've been doing, because feminism is not a Western invention, and sometimes I think that can get lost in our understanding of it. We think we create this thing and now we have to export it, but it's existed in so many different forms throughout all of time. It just wasn't called feminism, and so it's less about going to save and more about like putting these women on equal footing and saying, okay, what are your concerns? Because if you ask Muslim women in this country what their concerns are, it's not the hijab. It's being virtually unemployable if you're visibly Muslim. It's being, more likely to be the victim of an Islamophobic attack. Those are the things that those are feminist issues, and those are the things that we should be focusing on, I think.
I think, again, these guys know much more than I do, but in politics, the definition of politics is the art of the possible. You know, one really ought to be investing one's time in things that one can change, right? And looking out and saying globally there's this massive problem is all fine, but unless we're, you know, President of the United Nations or something, we're probably not in a place where we can have much effect at that level. I think, you know, if we work where we can in the spaces where we can, whether it's just the university or nationally or within Cambridge or whatever, then you have the possibility of making a difference, and that difference being seen and observed by others, and gradually sort of filtering outwards. And I think that's all I can see us doing. I think the grand ideas are grand, and it's good that some people have them, but they don't generally achieve very much.
Lola, do you want to respond to that?
No.
Okay.
I
No. Okay, sorry.
No, I think the idea of, again, it's the idea that we don't have to compare the oppressions of different women in different places, and it is really important to think, if we're going to localize feminism, to think about what affects us. But also, I don't think it's so much an idea that we can't help other women, it's just how we do it, what our help looks like. And if that means like supporting them in what does our support look like, and how can it help the people who are already doing existing work and have been doing existing work for as long as we have, how can we help them tackle those things instead of going to shine a light on this particular issue?
Right. Okay, last question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And this is directly from the BBC. If you could eliminate one pressure on women to make life easier, what would it be?
I know you gave us time to think of that. I mean, the only way I can see this is in terms, come back to something we said earlier, and I'm not sure it's a direct answer to the question, but what seems to me creates the pressure, certainly within the academic context, is women in minorities perceive themselves to be a minority. So I sort of want to leap ahead beyond to the position where people don't perceive themselves to be a minority, so they can perform as they want to and not feel that they're being judged against some norm. I'm not sure that's very clear, but I think, you know, there's this hurdle to overcome. Once we've overcome it, we'll wonder why there was ever a problem. But, you know, but getting to equal or sort of generally balanced representation in different areas is going to be very difficult. And when we get there, it won't be particularly hard to maintain it at all.
Is there anything you think that professors can do to kind of do that on a micro level, on an individual by individual basis?
And we you know, there's unconscious bias training. There's all these things that one needs to do, and we all suffer from unconscious bias, men and women both. So that can help, but it's how to send a message that it's absolutely normal for women to do something that is mostly done by men, without being patronizing, because that will come through immediately into the sense that people are being artificially boosted into something. So in fact, they have to believe it. I mean, there's nothing short of saying that the professors and other academics need to believe in gender equality, and that will demonstrate it, I think. But it's a big step.
Lola?
This is a tough question, and one that I struggled with. I think, like, the question assumes that all women face specific issues in the same way, and that isn't true because of different intersections. But I think one thing that I think it would be helpful to a pressure to get rid of is the kind of like pressure to be perceived in a specific way. So like, I think that ties into a lot of the idea of reclaiming anger in your activism, in your feminism. A lot of women are concerned with not calling themselves feminists because it represents this kind of angry, bra burning, et cetera, and I think it's really interesting to think that like, that is, if we allowed women the full range of their emotions, they could without putting on them this restriction of an idea of what it means to be palatable, what it means to be acceptable, they could say openly that gender depression makes them very, very angry and not be seen as hysterical and not be seen as irrational. So I think like the pressure to be perceived in a certain way is something that everybody faces, but women, there's a specific gendered aspect to women and non-men where often the way they are perceived takes precedent over their genuine feelings or their genuine emotion about something. Like, I've spoken to so many women who are in debates about specific things and will try their very best not to be angry or not to be upset because they don't want to give off a specific image. And I think it would be really, if we just let women be, if we just allowed them to exist in all their forms and to take whatever range of emotions they are feeling at a specific point, then that would be really interesting. And more people would be able to say that they're angry about things. I like anger. It's really helpful.
Yeah, amazing. Charlie?
I think like feeding on from that, in terms of like how we want to be perceived, something that we often tend to do is like mitigate our experiences and make them palatable, in the sense that something that, like, if we're honest about it, like, no, women don't talk about rape. They don't talk about if they've been raped. They don't talk about if they've been sexually harassed, for example. But they also don't talk about that guy in a van who like beeped his horn, or that person that touched them in a club, because it's so insidiously acceptable. And when we do talk about it, especially to our friends who are men, we kind of mitigate that and make it seem like it's okay because we don't want to offend them, we don't want to make them complicit, we don't want to make them feel guilty, we don't want to have that debate about like being angry about something that probably they didn't even recognize as a problem. And for me, that's a real issue, and I think that feeds into like how we perceive masculinity and femininity and feminism in general as well. So if we could release women from the pressure to mitigate their experiences and actually like have their voices heard, that would be really great, because I guarantee that when, for example, the government hears every single woman in the UK talking about their real experiences, there might be some change.
Again, I completely agree with everything people have said, but I think there is, like, looking at it from perspective from maybe when I was like 14, 15, there was a lot of pressure on just girls being perceived merely on the basis of their looks. And this definitely feeds into everything we were saying about how women are perceived in our culture. And I think this, sometimes, you know, if you get compliments about the way you look, it's nice, you know, but that shouldn't be everything that a young girl is being told. She shouldn't just be told, like, oh, you've got a nice thigh gap, you know, like, how screwed up is that? There needs to be different messages said to them, and also for them to be told about feminism as a way of kind of liberating themselves from this oppressive power structure, and to just accept that once we are allowed, without these oppressive ideas of gender, to just be who we are, we will all just be happier at the end of the day.
Amazing. Any questions? Helen?
I get really nervous about talking until the gate is working. So I'm doing the thing that I always do in panel events where like, this isn't a question, I'm just going to say a thing and then like would love it if people would talk about it. I'm really interested in the idea of like being a woman as being something that's just kind of defined on a set of completely impossible and conflicting aims. So like you should be having sex so you're not a prude, but not too much sex so you're a slut. Or like you should be smart, and like people should know you're smart, but you shouldn't be a know-it-all. Or like you should be confident around men, but not so confident that you're aggressive. And just, I don't know, I'd love to hear about like why this doesn't get called out as a thing. Like, do people genuinely believe that's a thing that some woman somewhere is capable of? Or do we just like keeping that going so like all women are constantly really insecure and self-conscious so they can't ever do anything?
Lol. I was like, that double wind. Yeah, double standards and hypocrisy are so problematic. And I think it's not just replicated in men, although mainly is, but also women have this thing as well, where like women sort of impose those standards on other women, which is incredibly damaging because it's like feeding into these like white patriarchal structures. Yeah, it makes me angry, like it really does. I'm not really sure how to go about changing that other than kind of creating your own narrative and like just like shrugging it off and calling it out quite publicly. But yeah, with you.
I think with certain criticisms you're kind of talking about, like, for example, when someone tells you to calm down when you're having a discussion, while it's also expecting you to want to voice these opinions, those are really tapping into very gendered criticisms of people, and it's so irritating, and I think they probably know that. So I don't know, how do you deal with that, especially on like a social media platform?
I think what's really interesting and what's really powerful, I think, is when women and non-men like talk to each other about those specific things. Like what I love about women-only spaces or spaces for women and non-binary people is that you get to really deconstruct those ideas with a group of people who will all suddenly go, oh, well, that's the thing that I was feeling like. That's why I constantly feel self-conscious, because I'm supposed to be a million things at once, and that's why I constantly feel like I'm not comfortable in my own like body or in my own skin or whatever. So I think one way to go about deconstructing it is to voice it more often. If you ever feel that, well, go to someone else who looks like you and ask, do you feel this thing too, and why do we feel it? And I think just like that would raise awareness a bit more, because I feel like loads of women struggle with the double standards and those kind of things in silence. They just think, well, this is the way that I'm taught that I'm supposed to be. And if I can't, live up to that standard, well, that's a failure in me. And obviously that's not the case. We're all failing across the board. And so to talk about and to celebrate the fact that we're not going to be these perfect things is really powerful, I think. And also that feeds into liking yourself. I think the most radical thing you can do is like yourself and other women. Please, don't fight with other women.
I think that's a great end note, unless, Dr. Padman, you have anything to add? No?
Well, I mean, the only thing I'd say, I mean, that description of, in some sense, the ideal woman with scare quotes around it, for me, it's not a bad description of the ideal man as well, right? I mean, somebody who is confident but not too confident, doesn't show off but knows a lot. I mean, all that is absolutely great. And so if I met a bloke like that, I'd say, fantastic, let's go out. But I know that's not, I mean, I sort of imagine it to be true, that men admire something else in men, right, than they admire in women, whereas we perhaps are less, distinguish less, the behaviours are good behaviours regardless. But I know from my time on the University Council and in the school office and various other places, the silverback gorilla, has a lot of admirers, and there are people who go into meetings and throw their weight around, the big swinging dick sort of phenomenon. And people queue up to say, oh yes, of course, that's what we have to do. So for men, men can behave in exactly the way that women aren't supposed to, and are often admired for it. But many of us admire men who behave well as well.
Yeah, I think just thinking about it, like what all of those characteristics go back to, like they are formulated in such a way as to like reflect the insecurity of men, and the sense that the like prizing kind of sexual attraction or sexual prowess, intelligence, strength, confidence, these are very much feeding into kind of like dominant ideas of what it means to be successful, which is very like problematic, very like white capitalist, for example. But they're also like, when they ask women to buy into it, it's like, I want you to tap into it enough to legitimize it as valuable and like valid methods of success, but not too much so that I won't be threatened as a man and threatened by what society tells me is successful, which is obviously going to be gendered into men. So it's almost like they hold people down so that other people can be raised up without actually trying to be raised up. I think it's ironic.
Amazing. I think that's a great end note. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to Carney Sharp from the BBC. And if you have any more thoughts, the Twitter hashtag is #100women. They're really hoping it will trend in Cambridge. So thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.